thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And actually, after such an introduction, I'm afraid the lecture is going to be an anticlimax. I mean, there you go. Actually, can everybody hear me all right? Is that okay? I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm sorry if I'm going to be speaking Anglo-mucus tonight. But it's sort of, the cold is finally settling down, but it may be, sometimes I apologize if it's, some of my phonemes are refracted through polymucosaccharide or whatever the stuff is. Anyway, it is a very great honor to be invited to give one of the Vice-Chancellor lecture series. And it's particularly welcome because it gives me the opportunity to talk about something that's been exercising me for over 30 years. Though it was only this spring that I was able to bring together my thoughts on this matter in a single place, the one-stop shop, a book available in all places where truth and enlightenment is valued, including here in the old fire station. And I'm going to talk about the themes that are in this book. I hope I press the knob. Aping Mankind, Darwinitis and the Misrepresentation of Humanity, which of course by no coincidence has the same title as this talk, and is a topic that I feel is central to my preoccupation as a humanist. And I think there's an important job to be done in the coming decades of the 21st century in developing a clear idea of what we humans are, what image we can form of ourselves in the wake of the, to me, welcome decline of religious belief. And this job will be all the harder if we commit ourselves to the wrong ideas that I'm going to be addressing in my talk. Now, if you feel at times during this talk you've fallen into the hands of someone who has a chronic obsession, you will not be mistaken. My dispute with Neuromania, for example, goes back to the time when I was a medical student at Oxford, focusing on neurophysiology and arguing with my infinitely patient tutor about what neuroscience can and cannot explain. And my master theme is biologism. Biologism, the assumption that we humans are essentially animal organisms and are best understood through the biological sciences. This is an idea actually of some antiquity, but it currently has unprecedented currency in academia, in the Republic of Letters, and indeed even in the popular press. And one of the most disturbing consequences of the ascendance of biologism is the belief, increasingly widespread in academia, that the humanities should acknowledge the cognitive superiority of biological science and should capitulate to the imperialist ambitions of neuroscience and evolutionary theory. Traditionally, we've thought of human beings as persons who are conscious agents responsible to a greater or lesser degree for their actions and, to a greater or lesser degree, offset from the natural world. And this is a view that I believe lies at the heart of humanism. The alternative view of humans as organisms that are part of the natural world is now, it seems to me, gaining strength. We are not, it is argued, as distant from nature, as construed by the natural sciences, as we once imagined we were. We do not so much lead our lives as enact our biological inheritance, and the impression we have to the contrary is based on an illusion. Now, there are many factors behind the rise of biologism, but the most important are firstly the astonishing advances in our understanding of the human body, the human organism. And this has been incorrectly interpreted as telling us what it is to be a human being. The second is the assumption, common in secular societies, that if we abandon supernatural accounts of what we are, we're also obliged to distance ourselves from, also obliged to deny our distance from the natural world and to seek a naturalistic, a biological, or indeed physical understanding of what we are. Now, both of these assumptions are wrong. We're more than just our bodies as understood biologically. We are embodied subjects who are, who possess, who utilize, who take care of, who judge, who interpret, and who have factual knowledge of our bodies in a multitude of ways. First point. And secondly, there's a middle position that sees us as neither supernatural nor entirely part of nature. We are extranatural. Now, biologism is founded on two pillars of unwisdom, Neuromania and Darwinitis, and I want to offer you a brief account of each. Neuromania is based on the assumption that human consciousness is identical with neural activity in the human brain. I am my brain, you are your brain. The brain explains every aspect of human awareness and behavior. From this it follows that if you want to understand human beings, you must peer into the darkness inside the skull, using neuroscientific techniques for recording brain activity. Now, the neuromaniac's favorite toy is a tool which has made huge contributions to real neuroscience, functional magnetic resonance imaging, an example of which you see on the slide, though alas, outside of real science, it's become, as Matt Crawford said, a fast-acting solvent of the critical sense. And it's almost impossible to open a newspaper without an example of a brain scan next to an article, breathless with excitement, reporting that scientists have found the secret of love, of wisdom, or of our sense of beauty. You just expose the subject to the relevant stimuli and see which bits of the brain light up. Now I want to turn our attention to the other pillar, Darwinitis. This is an inflamed or pathological version of Darwinism, which asserts that evolutionary theory explains not only how the organism Homo sapiens arose, but also the nature of people like you and me. Evolutionary forces, natural selection, survival advantage explain the origin and purpose of human behavior and of human institutions. Everything is forged in and distantly or otherwise relates to the bloodbath in which genes are shaped by the differential survival of organisms. Now, it's rarely expressed as crudely as that, but this is the ultimate implication. The processes that produce millipedes were just those that produced Mozart. In brief, it is the assumption that Darwinism encompasses not only the biological roots of the human organism, but the cultural leaves of the human person. And the boldest, most far-reaching and crudest manifestation of Darwinitis is evolutionary psychology, to which I'll return. Well, so much for the two pillars of biologism, and they're of course connected. If the human mind is identical with the functioning of the brain, and if the brain, as it surely is an evolved organ, then our minds, our consciousness, and our conscious behavior must be understood in evolutionary terms, as ultimately the servant of the reproductive imperative of the selfish gene. Since, as Theodosius Dobzhansky said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, the neural explanation of human consciousness demands a Darwinian interpretation of our behavior. The mind is simply the most powerful of the organs in the vehicle that the genes requisition to ensure their own survival. Now, you might think this sounds pretty harmless stuff, or better than harmless, a frank acknowledgement of what we are. But let's look at the consequences of biologism as they are drawn by those few writers who are honest about them. Consider first the consequences of neuromania as drawn out by that eminent neuroscientist Colin Blakemore in his excellent Reith lecture, The Mechanics of Mind, many years ago. The human brain, he said, is a machine, which alone accounts for all our actions, our most private thoughts, our beliefs. All our actions are products of the activity of our brains. It makes no sense, in scientific terms, to try to distinguish sharply between acts that result from conscious attention and those that result from our reflexes or are caused by disease or damage to the brain. This has huge implications for our freedom. If we are identical with our brains or with certain neural discharges in them, we must be just as unfree when we're writing a textbook about the management of epilepsy, as I have done, as when we ourselves are in the grip of an epileptic fit. It makes no sense in neuroscientific terms to distinguish between these things. And many have drawn this conclusion and asserted that free will is an illusion. Rita Carter, a brilliant popularizer of neuroscience, has even offered an explanation of that illusion of free will in Darwinian terms. The illusion of free will, she says, is deeply ingrained precisely because it prevents us from falling into a suicidally fatalistic state of mind. It's one of the brain's most powerful aids to survival. Well, if we are in the grip of biological forces, which boil down to physical forces, we can't be aware of the true reasons for our actions. Indeed, we are not agents at all. We are absorbed into nature, natural parts of a natural world, which, given that living matter is ultimately regulated by the laws of matter to court, were material parts of the material world, were wired physically into the forces of physical nature. Now, some of this is acknowledged with great good cheer by many writers, notably Daniel Dennett, when he speaks of Darwin's dangerous idea, which he's translated into Dennett's daft idea, as a universal acid that eats through just about every traditional concept and leaves in its wake a revolutionized worldview, in which our most cherished beliefs about God, value, meaning, purpose, culture, and morality are shown to be without foundation. But this applies only if accepting Darwinism, which I do, requires one to subscribe to Darwinitis, which I don't. Dennett, being an atheist like me, is quite sanguine and imagines that his view is consistent with humanism. I would strongly contest this, as indeed does Alex Rosenberg in his nihilistic Darwinism. He argues that Dennett correctly saw the corrosive effects of Darwin's theory, but then failed to acknowledge that this would lead to metaphysical nihilism and ethical nihilism if we felt what Darwin had to say was not just about the human organism, but about people. Because we would have to conclude that everything we do is an expression of the blind laws of physics. That is true, of course, only if we believe that Darwinism means Darwinitis. And it's this that makes it rather extraordinary that so many in the humanities, which one might expect will be a bulwark against fake science, scientism, should have embraced neuroscience and evolutionary theory as a guide to their own disciplines with such enthusiasm. Collaboration rather than resistance seems to be in the watchword. They've listened to the words of the once despised prophet E.O. Wilson, who has argued that the humanities, ranging from philosophy and history to moral reasoning, comparative religion, and interpretation of the arts, will draw closer to the sciences and partially fuse with them. And just in case you have forgotten where this leads to, Wilson spells it out in his visionary Consilience, published more recently, his dream of unified knowledge. Total consilience holds that nature, and that includes us, is organized by simple universal laws of physics to which all other laws and principles can eventually be reduced. And so the humanities are simply primitive physics, and when they see themselves aright, they will acknowledge this. Now, they haven't quite got this far, but there are some impressive halfway houses. For example, there is a flourishing pseudo-discipline of neuroaesthetics, which explains both creativity and aesthetic pleasure in terms of activity in certain parts of the brain. Brain tingles is all. And this propensity for brain tingles has been implanted in us by evolution, hence Darwinian aesthetics, which makes sure we tingle to the right kinds of things. For example, pictures of landscapes loaded with food. Neurolaw aims to replace the untidy processes of the judicial system with a biological justice rooted in an understanding of the neural causes of action. Neuroeconomics can explain why we buy things we don't need or we shouldn't buy by looking at the balance between the want-it center in the amygdaloid body and the wait until you can afford it center in the frontal lobes. Those toxic subprime mortgages were in fact neurotoxic. Conspicuous consumption and our trillion-pound debts are due to our desire to advertise our genetic health. Neuropoliticians tell us we should look beyond the ideologies of the right and left to an understanding of the rivalry between the right and left hemisphere. Neurotheologians look for God spots in the brain where religious experiences and beliefs are located. The evolutionary theorists of religion tell us that the God spot has been implanted in our brains because religion, believe it or not, promotes solidarity and inclusive fitness. Tell that to the historians of confessional wars, but that's another story. Now, it wouldn't take very long to expose the fallacies that are the foundation stones of all these pseudo-disciplines. Even so, I haven't got time in this lecture to do so. Never mind, it's all there in the book. The point for the present is that they are symptoms of a biologistic view of mankind, and it's this that I want to focus on. Now, the fact that such a view has undesirable consequences should not itself cut any ice. Just because you don't like something, it doesn't make it untrue. There's only an accidental connection between the palatable and the true. I find it rather unpalatable to think I'm going to die one day, but this doesn't make it untrue. Yuck is not an argument. So let me now focus on the fundamental errors of neuromania and Darwinitis, and let me start with neuromania. I want to look at the logical errors behind neuromania, then talk about current limitations of the science that make many claims premature, particularly in so-called social neuroscience, and finally about the fundamental barriers to neural explanations of consciousness that would remain even if the current limitations of the science were overcome. But first, the central muddle. Now, as a clinical neuroscientist for many years, I am fully aware that to live a human life requires a brain in some kind of working order. But what I dispute is that it follows from this that living a human life is to be a brain in some kind of working order. Neuroscience reveals some of the most important necessary conditions of behavior and awareness. But neuromania, by contrast, holds that it will give a complete account of the sufficient conditions of awareness and behavior. This mistaken idea is neuromania. And to explain the difference between a necessary and sufficient condition, To get knocked down by a bus in Salford, it's necessary to be in Salford. But being in Salford isn't a necessary condition of being knocked down by a bus. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to give this lecture. The philosophical error is to assume that the correlation between neural activity and consciousness means that neural activity is consciousness. So I see a little bit of the brain light up when I look at something, but it doesn't mean to say that looking at something, or indeed seeing something, is identical with the brain lighting up. So much for the logical error. And let me move to the empirical problems and illustrate them with two much discussed studies, which seem to some to confirm that even our most complex feelings, emotions, and activities are reducible to brain activity. And what's more, that even when we feel we're acting voluntarily, our brains, not ourselves, are calling the shots. I'm going to talk about Semiosekhi and Andreas Bartel's study of the neurobiology of love, and secondly, Benjamin Libet's studies of voluntary motor activity. First, Semiosekhi and Andreas Bartel's claim that they have now discovered what love is. They've discovered a center in the brain for romantic love. And they published this in a paper in 2001. And I have to say, subsequently, they published papers on love brackets maternal unbrackets and love brackets unconditional unbrackets. But let's focus on romantic love. How did they find out what romantic love was? How could they reduce it to neural activity? Well, what they did was they took a group of subjects and placed their heads, attached to their bodies, I hasten to add, in a functional magnetic resonance imaging scan. They then showed these characters pictures of their beloved and also of mere friends. And they subjected brain activity of the response to the pictures of the mere friends from the brain activity of the response to the beloved. And they repeated many times on many subjects. And they concluded that the difference between one and the other was essentially what was peculiar and specific about love. And what is love? Well, here it is. Love, romantic, is activity in a highly restricted area of the brain, in the medial insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, and subcortically in the caudate nucleus and the putamen. And you'll be glad to know, bilaterally. And here it is in pictures. That is love. Well, this awakens wonder, not that love could be tucked away in such a small space, but how could anyone fail to see the fallacies in the experimental design? They are many and various, but I just want to focus on one, which is a recurrent fallacy that plagues many studies in so-called social neuroscience using techniques like fMRI scanning. It is the grotesque reduction of the state in question, of love. Martians and neuromaniacs don't know that basically love is not like a response to simple stimulus, like a picture. It's not even a single enduring state, like being chilly. It is a many-splendid and many-miseried thing, as many writers have described. It includes not feeling in love at that moment. It includes hunger for the beloved, simulated indifference to the beloved, delight in the beloved, wanting to be kind, wanting to impress, the special other, and so on and so forth. It is many, many other things. These are things that anyone who'd been in love, or read about it in a book, or even read about it in a crayoning book, would actually know that love is an extremely complex and many splendid, as I say, a many miseried thing, and it isn't just a response to a stimulus. It's therefore unlikely to be the property of a part of an organ, particularly a giblet called the brain. It's not simply a property of an organism as a whole. It belongs to a self, and that self relates to something that goes way beyond the brain, way beyond the body, a community of minds. Now, the neuralization of love requires reducing it to a response to something like a simple, repeatable stimulus. And this is deeply connected with the project of Neuromania, which is to stuff something whose theatre is the community of selves, operating the human world, back into the intracranial darkness, back into a standalone brain. Well, you're relieved to know that even the neuroscience community is starting to feel uneasy about the simplistic identification of activity in parts of the brain with human feelings and propensities to behavior. In a paper originally provocatively entitled Voodoo Correlations in Social Neuroscience, Ed Vowles and Harold Paschler, and Harold Paschler is a very serious psychologist. He was the editor of the great textbook of physiological psychology. They found very elementary flaws with the localizations observed in such studies, and I'm happy to discuss them with you. But the process of simplification to prepare a piece of our humanity to be stuffed back into the brain is evident in this second example. This is a famous set of experiments carried out by the neurophysiologist Benjamin Libet in the 1980s and repeated and refined many times since. Experiments described by neurophysiologist Patrick Haggard as one of the philosophically most challenging studies in modern scientific psychology. These studies seem to show that it's our brains that make the decisions to act before our conscious mind is aware of them. So they're not really our decisions at all. Well, let's take a typical experiment. What Libet did is ask his subjects to make a very simple movement, either to flex their wrist or to flex their finger, of the right hand. They had to do it in their own time. Using electroencephalography or brainwave recording, he recorded a particular activity in the brain that indicates that there's a readiness to move. This is a so-called readiness potential. And it's seen in the part of the cerebral cortex most intimately associated with voluntary movement. So he recorded the time of the readiness potential. But he also asked his subjects to time their own intentions to move. And the way they did it was they followed a spot moving on a clock. And they noted the time on the clock when that spot, where the spot was when they felt ready to move. And the extraordinary thing, or extraordinary to Libet, and to many people since, they found was that the experience of intention to make a movement actually occurred after the brain's readiness potential, about a third of a second. In other words, it seemed as if the brain was getting going before the person was even aware of the intention to make the movement. Well, that's been criticized for all sorts of reasons, but then a rather extraordinary study, rather supporting Libet, was published a few years ago by a group in Berlin, John Dylan Hayes and his gang. And what do they do? Well, they did this. What they did was they asked subjects to either move their right finger or their left finger, or to press a right button or a left button. Meanwhile, there's a whole succession of letters were being displayed on the screen. And the subjects were asked to time their intention to move the left or the right by noting the letter that was on the screen when they decided to move the left or the right hand. Extraordinarily, the brain activity associated with movement of the left hand or the right hand took place a full 5 seconds before people were aware of the intention to make the relevant movement. In fact, the brain scientists could anticipate whether the person was going to move the left or the right hand before the person themselves was aware of it. This is really even more extraordinary than Libet's study. And they concluded from this that there's a network of higher control areas that begins to prepare a decision long before it enters awareness. In other words, the brain was getting on with the business of, as it were, deciding in inverted commas whether you're going to move your left hand or your right hand even before you knew what you were doing. In short, we don't know what we're doing until we've found we've done it. And Daniel Wegner brought together a huge literature on unconscious influences on our decision to do things. And he came to the conclusion that the only connection between willing something and carrying out the action is both the willing and the act come from the same unconscious sources. So it looks very much as if indeed the brains are calling the shots. And we are indeed caught in a nexus of connections that have little to do with our free will, little to do with our intentions. Hold on a moment. Let's look again at both Libet and Soon's experiments. The first thing, of course, you've got to remember is the actions were extraordinarily simple. A flexion of the wrist, the pressing of a button. What's more, these actions were only a minute part of a long series of movements amounting to a large-scale action which could be described as taking part in Dr. Libet's experiment. And this large-scale action began at least as far back as getting up in the morning to visit Dr. Libet's laboratory, after perhaps setting the alarm the night before to make sure you weren't late. It involved consenting to take part in an experiment whose nature and purpose and safety you understood. And it required, among many other things, listening to and agreeing to the instructions that were received, and then deciding at some time or other to flex the wrist. In other words, the immediate prior intention, the psychological event, timed by Libet was not the whole story of the action, only a tiny part of it. It was preceded by many others that were minutes, hours, perhaps days before the action. So the real story is not just a flexing of the wrist, but one of a sustained and complex resolve being maintained over a very long time. And this includes many items of behaviour, getting on and off buses in order to get to Dr. Libet's laboratory, looking for the laboratory, cancelling or declining other commitments so as to be free to attend, and so on and so forth, all of which had many thousands of components. And it may be part of a greater intention, such as wanting to please Dr. Libet, or wanting to help those clever scientists understand the brain, as it might one day help doctors to treat my child's brain injury more effectively. Now, Libet's experiment illustrates how the neuromaniac case against freedom, seemingly demonstrating that we are our brains, and our brains are calling the shots, is rooted in a very distorted conception of what constitutes an action in everyday life. If you want to make voluntary actions seem involuntary, the first thing you do is strip away their context, remove the self from which they originate, remove the nexus of meanings, that is the world to which they are addressed, and then effectively break them down into their physical elements. And this gets you well on the way to eliminating the difference between a twitch and a deliberate action, and to make an action seem as if it could be explained by a burst of nerve impulses, embedded in a no-person neuroreality, rather than a first-person world, where behaviour is not atomic but interconnected. The locus of free will is a field of intention, rooted in the self and its world that extends beyond the laboratory. No wonder in the laboratory setting the actions look simply like events that happen to the actor. They're seen to be effects. So much for the empirical evidence that seems to support the assumption that consciousness boils down to neural activity. Things like intentions boil down to neural activity. But let me subject this assumption directly to criticism. Now, my critique is based upon this inescapable fact. When we're talking about the brain, we're talking about a piece of matter subject to the laws of physics. And this is what Daniel Dennett, a leading proponent of neuromania, pointed out. And Dennett recently criticized me by saying that I was a retrogressive defender of an outmoded view of the world, which makes me think I must be onto the right track. There's only one sort of stuff, he said, namely matter. The physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. And the mind is somehow nothing but a physical phenomenon. In short, the mind is the brain. We can, in principle, account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials that suffice to explain radioactivity, continental drift, photosynthesis, reproduction, nutrition, and growth. Whew. Now, if we keep this in mind, we have enough ammunition to demonstrate the necessary failure of neuroscientific accounts of human consciousness and conscious human behavior. And I emphasize human consciousness because it has unique features that are intractable to assimilation into the properties of matter. These are intentionality, first-person being, and unity within and over time and temporal depth. And my central message in this next section of the next few minutes is that we have serious problems understanding the relationship between brain and even ground floor consciousness. As I will demonstrate in a second, it's absurd to look to brain science to cast light on the upper stories of human consciousness, such as love, wisdom, or indeed voluntary activity. Now, the arguments that are going to come in the next 5 to 10 minutes are quite tough, but you shouldn't blame me for your suffering about the neuromaniacs with their philosophical errors. Well, let's begin on the ground floor with something very simple. Perception, as it is experienced in humans. The explicit sense of being aware of something other than oneself. Consider my awareness, or this person's awareness, of the glass in front of her. Now, the standard account says that her perception of the glass is the result of light reflected from the glass, entering her eyes, and triggering activity in her visual pathways. That's the upper arrow there. There's an unbroken causal chain connecting the glass with neural activity in the brain, all the way back to the visual cortex or wherever. And this chain of causes and effects is entirely compatible with physical science. Unfortunately, that's not enough. The inward causal path doesn't deliver awareness of glass as an item explicitly separate from the subject, explicitly separate from the person who's looking at it. There's being over there with respect to someone who's over here. There's nothing in the activity in the visual cortex, in nerve impulses that are material events and material object, which would make that activity be about the thing that the person sees, about the glass that is explicitly other than her brain, other than her visual cortex. In other words, the inward causal chain explains how the light gets into the brain, but not how this results in a gaze that looks out. So we have something fundamental that's left unexplained, what philosophers have called the intentionality that makes the activity in the visual cortex, putatively, be about the glass. Now, intentionality is utterly mysterious, not the least because it points in the opposite direction to causality. You can see the upper arrow goes one way and the lower arrow goes another way. Opposite direction to the causal chain that passes into the visual cortex, through it to other parts of cortex, and eventually to those parts of the brain associated with motor activity. Intentionality is not feedback, it's not reverse causation, but it's something that opens up an otherwise causally closed world and makes it something, that world something an agent can operate on. If neuromania were true, my perception of the glass would require the neural activity in the visual cortex to reach causally upstream to the events that cause them, because the events in the glass, of course, occur before the events in the visual cortex. And this is inexplicable in material terms, and crucially, it's most explicitly developed in human perception, where we have an embodied subject facing a material object. And it's where we have to begin when we're trying to understand human consciousness. The neural theory of consciousness cannot deal with the essentially relational aspect of consciousness, for which a single player, such as neural activity, is not enough. Now, intentionality, which cannot be ascribed to material events, such as nerve impulses, is of the utmost significance. It tears open the hitherto seamless fabric of a causally closed material world, as described by physics. And, as I discuss in the book, it's the seed of first-person being, the seed of a viewpoint that is planted in a no-person, viewpointless physical universe. It's the basis of our uniquely human freedom, of the community of minds, and of the human world, that nexus of meaning and signs, the so-called semiosphere that is beyond the biosphere and beyond the reach of neuroscience. Suffice to say that intentionality creates the possibility of an ever-widening gap between the conscious individual and the material world. And this possibility is most fully realized in humans who are not simply organisms, but embodied subjects. And our awareness is of the form that such and such is the case. We are knowing animals rather than merely sentient beings. And we are surrounded not just by matter, but by thater, most clearly expressed in factual knowledge, knowledge that's held in common and housed in language, such as a body of knowledge that is brain science itself. Now, focusing on intentionality brings us to the heart of the trouble that the neural theory of perception, and consequently of higher consciousness, such as love or whatever, is in. Its central claim that the material interaction between two material objects, say the brain and that bottle over there, will cause one to appear to the other. The counter-causal direction of intentionality not only shows that this cannot be accommodated in physical science, which is the ultimate parent of neuroscience, but that appearance is not something that the material world, as seen through science, affords. Indeed, we could go further and argue that the progressive enclosure of the world within the framework of physical science, its being construed as a world of matter, tends towards the elimination or the disappearance of appearance. As the science of matter progresses, measurement takes us further from actual experience, further from the phenomena of subjective consciousness, to a realm in which things are described in abstract, general quantitative terms. And the most obvious symptom of this is the way physical science has to discard what are being called by the philosophers secondary qualities, items such as colour experiences, feelings of warmth and cold, and tastes. They are regarded as somehow unreal, or at least as falling short of what the furniture of the material world is in itself. For the physicists, as you know, light is not in itself bright or colourful or cheerful. It's a mixture of vibrations in an electromagnetic field of different frequencies. The material world, far from being the colourful, noisy, smelly paste we experience, is composed of colourless, silent, odourless atoms or quarks or whatever, whose nature and behaviour is best described mathematically. Physical science, that is to say, is about the marginalisation and ultimately the disappearance of phenomenal appearance. But consciousness is centrally about appearances. So nothing in physical science can explain why a physical object such as a brain should find, uncover, or create appearances in the world. We could put this another way by saying that matter in itself doesn't generate viewpoints, and there are no appearances without viewpoints. For example, there are no appearances or phenomenal appearances of a rock that are neither from the front or from the back or from any other angle. The view from nowhere, as Thomas Nagel described it, the view from nowhere of physical science does not accommodate viewpoints. So this is how the material world would look as revealed by a bit of the material world, such as the brain. The Schrödinger wave equation, which many of you will be familiar with from physics, captures an ultimate, all-encompassing scientific truth about the world, a viewless view of material reality, and has nothing to say about the experience of the world, although, of course, it is indirectly based on the experience of the world mediated through techniques and instruments of science. Now, the loss of appearances and of viewpoint and of first-person being is not an accidental mislaying. It is an inevitable consequence of the scientific conception of matter, including pieces of matter such as the brain. The brain, being a piece of matter, must be person-free. No wonder neuroscience cannot find the self or the conscious agent in the brain. And this is true not in the fundamental sense I've just highlighted, but a less fundamental but no less important sense. Persons or selves have two features which cannot be captured in neural terms: unity in multiplicity and temporal depth. And I want to touch briefly on both of these, and then I shall leave philosophy, this kind of philosophy behind, you'll be glad to know. But first, unity in multiplicity. At any given moment, you are aware of a multitude of experiences, sensations, perceptions, memories, thoughts, emotions. You are co-conscious of them. That's to say, they're integrated into a unity of a sort. And it's difficult to see how this integration is possible, since neurophysiology assigns them to spatially different parts of the brain. Aspects of consciousness, we are to believe, are kept very tightly apart. The pathways for perception are kept separate from those for emotion, which are separate from those for memory, which are separate from those from motivation, which are separate from those for judgment, and so on. Within perception, vision, hearing, and smell have different pathways and different destinations. And within visual perception, different parts of the brain are supposed to be responsible for receiving the color, the shape, the distance, the classification, the purpose, and the emotional significance of seen objects. When, however, I see a glass over there and see that it's broken, and I feel cross about it, while I hear you laughing, and I recognize the laughter as yours, and I'm upset, and I notice the taxi I've ordered has arrived so I can catch the train, I'm aware I must not miss. Many things that are kept apart in the brain must somehow be brought together. There is no such model of synthesis in the brain. This is a so-called binding problem, and various solutions have been offered them, none of them the slightest bit plausible. I'll be happy to discuss that in question time. So much for unity in multiplicity. But what of the neurological explanation of the other distinctive feature of subjectivity, temporal depth? The human subject is aware of a past, her own past and the shared past, that is history, and reaches into a future, her own future and a shared future, the tomorrow we all look forward to and share. But for simplicity's sake, let me just focus on the past. There are many quite supposed neurological accounts of memory, but they have one thing in common. They see memory, in the French philosopher Henri Bergson's slightly scornful phrase, as a cerebral deposit. Memory is, to use a slippery term, stored as an effect on the brain, expressed in the altered reactivity of the brain. And this has been demonstrated to the satisfaction of many neurophysiologists and cognitive neuroscientists in creatures as disparate as apes, chick embryos, and fruit flies. Some of the most lauded work on memory, which won Eric Kandel his 2000 Nobel Prize, has been on the sea slug. Now, the sea slug, one has to remember, does not have the kind of memories that you and I have. Sea slugs don't rack their meager allocation of 20,000 neurons to remember something. They don't feel nostalgia for the time before they met Eric Kandel, before the time when they had electric shocks applied to their tail. And all of those things. They don't have memory as it really is in human beings. And why is this the case? Well, a neural account of memory can't deal with the difference between perceptions and memories because there is no past tense, or indeed future tense, in the material world. As Einstein said, physicists know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. Whether it's true or not it is, well, he was correct in saying that, it is true that tense, the sense of the past and the sense of the future, cannot be found in the material world. Now, there are many more philosophical problems, but you probably feel enough already. I've dealt with Neuromania, and if you feel there's more problem, it has more going for it, I'm very happy to discuss it. But I want to move across to Darwinitis. Now, once we've established that mind and brain activity are not identical, then I would argue we've also pulled the rug from beneath Darwinitis, since the mind ceases to be something that has co-evolved with the brain. Darwinitis, however, deserves some attention of its own, because it's such a dominant presence in our thinking about ourselves. The notion that we're just animals, and that the differences between human life in the library or the operating theatre and animal life in the jungle or the savannah are more apparent than real, at most matters of degree rather than kind. Now, to combat this view, which I disagree with, by appealing to high-end activities such as composing symphonies, religious worship, or fretting over transfinite numbers, is a mistake. The differences between ourselves and beasts are wall to wall, and they relate as much to those things that seem to be mirrored in animal behavior as to those things in which we are quite obviously unique. For we humans take the biological givens and transform them out of all recognition. And let me illustrate this with two fairly homely examples: feeding behavior and learning behavior. And first, feeding behavior. Supposing you invite me out for a meal. Having learnt you've just taken on a big loan for a house, which has turned into a mound of negative equity, as is the way of houses, I choose the cheapest items on the menu, and I falsely declare that I'm full after the main course to spare you the expense of a pudding. A chimpanzee gives a banana to another chimpanzee who eats it. Now, Darwinitics would like to say that both the chimp and I are doing similar things because we're both exhibiting feeding behavior. But this identity description obscures huge differences between the chimp's behavior and mine. Anyone who's acquainted with the most routine dinner table, the products of a vast number of deliberate actions on the part of those sitting round it, will be on their guard when they hear the phrase feeding behavior applied to both humans and beasts. An ordinary meal is the end point of a long journey away from biology. Cooking, eating regulated by the clock and the calendar, the complex structure of meals, and the grammar of what goes with what, which pudding goes with which main course, the ritualistic, symbolic, and celebratory aspects of eating, the multitude of items of tableware that have come from near and far, the journeys taken by the food to the table, the journeys undertaken by those who gather around the table, and the use of money as the all-purpose commodity to purchase food. These are but a few of the ways in which human dining is distanced from animal eating. These are all increasingly sophisticated aspects of man, the animal who does things explicitly, and whose natural medium is a community of minds extending geographically across the globe and historically into the accumulated consciousness of the race. The laden table draws on 4/4 of the earth and great tracts of past and present human consciousness. Even something simple and as boring as buying a can of beans is surrounded by implicit frameworks of action and understanding, shops, contracts, sustained intentions, commodities, money, that have no counterpart in animal life. And take learning behavior. Here's a fairly ordinary example. I decide to improve my career prospects by signing up for a degree course which begins next year. But I have a small child. I therefore do more babysitting this year in order to stockpile some tokens in the babysitting circle. Daisy the cow bumps into an electric wire, has her arse fried, and henceforth avoids that place. Now, it could be said that both Daisy and I have been exhibiting learning behavior. But I think you'll agree the difference between the two forms of behavior are greater than the similarities. And the example that I've just given emphasizes something that's unique about human learning. It's not something that merely happens. Cows bump into things and learn thus. It is something that has to be done and organized. And this is connected with the fact that humans uniquely practice skills and memorize, while animals do not. What's more, animals do not teach their young, not outside of Disneyland anyway. Human learning is often a collective exercise and mediated by institutions, and involves not merely being shaped by experience, but acquiring factual knowledge. We seek out that which we learn. What is more, learning for humans is part of the narrative of a life that is led rather than merely lived. But let's stand back and see the bigger picture, the human world to which feeding behavior and learning behavior belong, by which they are supported and which they support. This world, woven out of shared attention, out of 1 trillion cognitive handshakes, is, I've used the word already, a semiosphere, a realm of signs and meanings, quite remote from the biosphere in which all other sentient creatures live and have their being. Most of our actions in daily life, however concrete, typically make sense only with respect to frameworks of which we're conscious, which incorporate many layers of abstraction. Think of all the steps you took to get to this talk this evening, beginning with a moment perhaps a few weeks ago when you saw today's program. Or think even of the elements that make up something as utterly commonplace as shopping. It would require the whole many hours to unpack the innumerable implicit frames of reference that make sense of the seemingly simple act of buying a can of beans. None of these frames of reference has any counterpart in the life of beasts. This world transcends the organism Homo sapiens, as it was delivered by Darwinian processes hundreds of thousands of years ago. These hundreds of thousands of years are the measure of how far Darwinitis, which sees us simply as other primates, are out of date. And the attempt to stuff this inescapably shared, temporally deep realm back into the intracranial darkness inside our skulls is doomed and will inevitably close up all the distances that separate us from our organic state. So we shall indeed start explaining shopping or our aesthetic preferences by references to the behavior of Pleistocene man, chimpanzees or herring gulls. In short, we should be on the road to reducing the humanities to the animalities. Well, we've stepped outside of our organic bodies into a domain where things are made explicit. In that domain, uniquely, unlike other creatures, we guide, justify, and excuse our behavior according to general and abstract principles. We create cities, laws, and institutions. We entertain theories about our own nature and about the world. We frame our individual lives within a shared history and systematically inquire into the order of things and the patterns of causation and physical laws that seem to underpin that order. These phenomena, profound and complex and pervasive though they are mere surface manifestations or symptoms of something even more profound, complex, and pervasive, that we are explicit animals who lead our lives, living out shared and individual narratives rather than merely living them, who are conscious of ourselves, of others, and of the material world and its intrinsic existence and its intrinsic properties in a way that no other animal does. V.S. Ramachandran, like Colin Blakemore, a neuroscientist and Reith lecturer, spoke truly when he asserted that humanity transcends apehood to the same degree by which life transcends mundane physics and chemistry. And this seems so obvious that it's difficult to see why so many thinkers so stubbornly insist on overlooking what is in front of their noses. And the answer is in part because we are so used to using language carelessly, describing humans animalomorphically and animals anthropomorphically, that we no longer notice ourselves doing it. This is a theme for a talk in itself, and it would focus on such seemingly innocent terms such as courtship and grooming. But there's also a misplaced sense of honesty, in which we feel forced to conclude that because we're like animals in some respects, birth, copulation and death, and many things in between, biological processes, we must be like animals in all respects. But this overlooks how we transform every aspect of the biological givens that frame our lives. Now, as a doctor whose career spanned obstetrics and old age medicine, I can understand how this error might arise. We imagine, what's more, that after the origin of species, we're obliged to think of ourselves as animals. But to do so is to confuse our biological origins with our cultural leaves, the organisms delivered by biological processes, with the people who are mutually and self-shaping by processes that are remote from those seen in the biological material of our bodies. But it is our linguistic habits that are most potent. And this is true also of neuromania. We personify the brain. We talk about bits of the brain making decisions, judging, communicating, signaling. So we're then able to, having personified the brain, brainify the person. Some Darwinitics are unable to ignore what is in front of their noses and acknowledge that there is a huge ditch between man and even the biologically closest beasts. And these Darwinitics have been strongly attracted to the notion of the meme, first floated by Richard Dawkins in his first book, The Selfish Gene. A meme is a unit of cultural transmission, analogous to the gene, which is a unit of biological transmission. Like genes, memes are replicators, but we are told they use minds as vehicles. According to many meme theorists, memes are like viruses that invade our mind brains. The memes that survive are those, while they may not be good for the organism carrying them, are good for the survival of the groups of organisms. And so we have the Darwinian notion of natural selection resulting in the differential survival of the fittest applied to cultural change. Excuse me. If you find this notion plausible, you will find it less so when you look at the kinds of things that evolutionary psychologists give as examples of memes. And here are some suggested by Daniel Dennett: returnable bottles, Moby Dick, the SALT agreement, faith or tolerance for free speech. And these at once suggest why the idea of the meme is vacuous. First, tolerance for free speech. While it may be good for a group, it's hardly an item with its own boundaries as a gene is. Abstract nouns do not correspond to items with their own edges. Secondly, the difference between genotype and phenotype is lost. Thirdly, ideas such as free speech are ones we have to understand in order to embrace. And we may not assent to them. Some people are bitterly opposed to the notion of free speech. Just try assenting to, or indeed dissenting from, your genes. And finally, it makes the mind a kind of lumber room, full of bric-a-brac. In short, meme theory is a measure of the desperate need that is felt by some thinkers to biologize cultures, and hence the people that make, maintain, and modify culture. They imagine that seeing ourselves in the foxed mirror of the animal kingdom, we shall see ourselves more clearly. Though I'm not persuaded that we've taken anything from our observation of animals other than we've put in, and that what seems to be new is simply bouncing our old ideas about ourselves in an animal mirror. Well, you'll be glad to know it's time for me to come to a close. I spent my time addressing what seems to be one of the most widely received beliefs of our time, namely that biology is the key to human nature, that we're best understood as largely unconscious or programmed organisms operating in a natural world rather than as conscious agents acting in a uniquely human one. And it follows from this, so the argument goes, that the traditional humanities are biological sciences in a primitive state of development. And the consequences of biologism, if thought through, are appalling. The gap between human and non-human animals is elided. Even higher level awareness is reduced to the properties of living matter concerned only with continuation through reproduction and repair. With the identification of the human mind with the functioning of the organic brain, the assumption of a fundamental difference between human actions and other events in the material world, between your, say, coming to this lecture and the chemotaxis of a single-celled organism toward nutrients, or the fall of stones, seems shaky. The impersonal, unbreakable laws of the physical world, the blind watchmakers that Richard Dawkins identified correctly as the drivers to the evolutionary process, encroach upon, engulf, and digest humanity. So biologism, as I've said, is propped up by these two pillars of unwisdom, Neuromania and Darwinitis. And I hope you are sufficiently persuaded by my arguments to agree that this is the most appropriate place for these ideas. Now, you may think that no one takes them serious enough to follow their conclusions. If this was so, they would still be important as obstacles to our trying to understand nature in a way that doesn't invoke your supernatural explanations. For me, an atheist, but also a humanist, naturalistic or biologistic accounts of us are as unsatisfactory and imprisoning as supernatural ones. And a great task lies ahead in trying to make sense of ourselves. And I think Neuromania and Darwinitis get in the way. And this could be, if we set them aside, things could become very exciting. I'm entirely one with Jerry Fodor, who says, when he says, we can't, as things stand now, so much as imagine the solution to the problem of consciousness. Excuse me. The revisions of our concepts and theories that imagining a solution will eventually require are likely to be very deep and very unsettling. There's hardly anything we may not have to cut loose from before the problem is through with us. But what's more, Neuromania and Darwinitis may be worse than merely obstructive, stopping us even starting to think. They may be dangerous. For example, John Gray, once a political philosopher, but now a hugely acclaimed celebrity misanthrope and a ferocious anti-humanist, has argued in his best-selling Straw Dogs that Darwin has demonstrated that we're not particularly special. Human life has no more meaning than that of a slime mold. Man is only one of many species and not obviously worth preserving. Speak for yourself, Professor Gray. Ideas have consequences, Abstract arguments may begin by looking like harmless puppies, but they may grow up to be something else. And that's why I've ridden this hobby horse for so long and so hard. Well, it is time, you'll be glad to learn, for me to wind up. As the late, great Humphrey Lyttelton might have put it, I hear the tortoise of time exploding in the microwave of eternity. And I've spent my time criticizing what seems to me one of the most widely received ideas of our time, namely that biology is the key to human nature. Those who try to explain love, conscience, human institutions by describing what they find when they peer into the brain are like someone who applies a stethoscope to this item, an acorn, and hopes to hear the rustling of the breezes in an oak forest. Neuromaniacs and Darwinitics are trying to find excuse me, the community of minds forged from a trillion cognitive handshakes in bits of the standalone brain, lighting up in the intracranial darkness. Even if you start from the brain, which may not be the worst place to start, you have to leave the brain behind when you're talking about social phenomena that are established in, evolve in, and are supported by the community of minds. And I want to end by emphasizing that I have no problem with biology. How could I? I'm a doctor whose treatments depended on biological science. I spent 30 or more years adding my small grains of truth to the great monument that is clinical neuroscience. Nor do I have a religious agenda. I'm an atheist humanist, nor am I crazy enough to question Darwin's theory of evolution. I'm not a creationist nutter. All of these things I've been accused of, and worst of all, I've been accused of being a dualist, one who thinks of the mind as being like a ghost in a meat machine. I don't believe that at all. But this gives me the cue for a final thought from the great philosopher Gilbert Ryle in his classic, The Concept of Mind. Man, he said, need not be degraded to a machine by being denied to be a ghost in the machine. He might be a sort of animal, namely a higher mammal, but there has yet to be ventured the hazardous leap to the hypothesis that perhaps he is man. And I think it's time we took that hazardous leap. So there you are, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your attention, or at least for courteously simulating it. Thank you.